Early abolitionists. All right, so abolitionism is like to abolish something. If I abolish you from the class, you are gone. So abolition is the idea of getting rid of slavery. Pretty straightforward there. And it started out, like we've actually learned about before, with the Quakers in Pennsylvania. They're the first ones to really kind of work towards the abolition of slavery in America, and other places too. Um, the early abolitionist movement focused on sending blacks back to Africa, and it kind of really showed how, although the abolitionists didn't want slavery, they didn't think it was a good thing for people to be forced into a life of slavery. That didn't necessarily equate with the idea of blacks, Africans being equal to whites. So, although abolitionists were working towards getting rid of slavery, that didn't necessarily mean that they weren't racist, that they didn't think that whites were superior. They just thought that it wasn't a good thing to enslave people in general. So, like I said, kind of showing this still sort of racism that is present, there's the idea of kind of setting up a colony in Africa for freed blacks. So the American Colonization Society was developed, was formed, and that organization was focused on setting up a colony for freed blacks in West Africa. So they actually did this. So Liberia, they kind of created out of nothing this country of Liberia in Western Africa as kind of a haven for emancipated slaves. About 15,000 enslaved Africans, or I guess newly freed Africans, went back to Liberia by 1860. So it was strange because most didn't want to necessarily go back to Africa. They had been born in America, they had never been in Africa in their whole entire life. So it was kind of this strange idea of like, how do we solve the problem of slavery? Well, let's just send them back to Africa where they came from. So about 15,000 did make their way actually back to Liberia. In fact, the capital of Liberia was named after President Monroe. They called it Monrovia. Okay. So in 1830, that's when things kind of started to change, when abolitionists really kind of, that movement kind of picked up some speed, so to speak, in the 1830s. A big thing that happened in 1833 is that Britain officially abolished slavery. Before, in 1807 or 1808, whatever it was, they had stopped the slave trade, but in 1833, Britain abolished slavery, and that was mostly due to the efforts of one of their parliament members who was a Reformed Christian, and his name was William Wilberforce. So William Wilberforce really instrumental in getting rid of slavery in Britain. Also, the Second Great Awakening, that whole religious movement, which we talked about last chapter, also was kind of a spark that picked up the abolitionist movement a bit more in America. When we're talking about early abolitionists, we have to talk about Theodore Weld. He was a white man. He was very simple, uneducated, but he was really able to relate then to simple, uneducated Americans. He was sponsored by some wealthy New York merchants, I should say, Arthur and Louis Tappan were brothers in New York, and they sponsored him to go to school. So they gave him money. He went to Lane Theological Seminary. So Theodore Weld is going to this school, but he is kicked out when he and a group of his friends organizes this epic 18-day-long debate over the issue of slavery. However, once he's kicked out of this seminary, Lane Theological Seminary, he and his group of friends then start kind of going out, especially around the Old Northwest Territory, and kind of spreading the anti-slavery message as they went, and they were called the Lane the Lane rebels from the name of the school, Lane, rebellion, rebels. So the Lane rebels then went out across the Old Northwest Territory and really started to make some noise for the anti-slavery cause. Our friend Theodore Weld also wrote a pamphlet called American Slavery as It Is, and this pamphlet was instrumental in influencing our friend that we talked about earlier, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in her writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So his pamphlet really kind of influenced, or the ideas in the pamphlet really influenced Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, next section, radical abolitionism. Wow, I said that word. Radical abolitionism. Sure, that's how you say that. So this last section we were talking about kind of the early movements of it, seeing in the 1830s that really picked up speed with the Second Great Awakening, with Britain outlawing slavery. But now we're talking about the radicals. The radicals. We couldn't miss talking about in this section William Lloyd Garrison. Huge name in American history. William Lloyd Garrison created a newspaper called The Liberator, and he published this paper for over 30 years, and he wanted the immediate abolition of slavery. He wanted slavery to be over with. He also set up the American Anti-Slavery Society. He founded that in 1833. And this society, the American Anti-Slavery Society, wanted the immediate abolition of slavery, and at its height it had over 250,000 members, so kind of a big deal. Of course, there were also blacks who were abolitionists as well. David Walker, he was from the South, but he was born free. He was a African American. He wrote a pamphlet called "Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World." Wow, "Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World." David Walker wrote this pamphlet, and this pamphlet supported the idea of a violent overthrow of slavery. Okay, so he was one of the black abolitionists. Maybe perhaps two more famous ones you've probably heard of. Sojourner Truth. She was a free black woman from New York, and she really connected slavery with religion. So she used her religious passion and condemned slavery as a sin. We have Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass has a very epic life story. He was born a slave in the South. His dad had been a white man. So he was born in the South into slavery. He learned to read and write on his own, and at age 21 escaped slavery and headed north. So he was a runaway slave. He was kind of discovered by the abolitionists when they were having a meeting in Massachusetts, and he stood up and gave this very articulate, charismatic, wonderful speech, kind of off-cuff. And the abolitionists, or those in the movement, were like, we need him. So they kind of wrangled him and put him to the forefront. He wrote a book, an autobiography about his life. That's what autobiographies are, I suppose, called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So that was pretty epic. But also, he, kind of like the two big names when we're talking about radical abolitionists, we're going to talk about William Lloyd Garrison, who had that Liberator, that newspaper, but he's often kind of compared to Frederick Douglass, because how they approached the issue of slavery was kind of two different ways. Douglass was very much Frederick Douglass, I should say, looked towards politics to end slavery. So, we see the anti-slavery cause really endorsed by different political parties. At first it was endorsed by the Liberty Party, and then we get the Free Soiler Party, and eventually we'll get the Republican Party. Douglass was more kind of focused on politics, like let's work through politics to get this done. And then Garrison, he he was more interested in kind of his own righteousness. He burned the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Garrison hated politics, and Garrison really more pointed towards the sin of slavery than any solution towards it. All right, let's keep going. The South lashes back. No pun intended. All right, so this is talking about the South's response to this growing abolitionist movement. So where is the South? Well, it is all the states that are south of something called the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line is like literally a geography line that was created in the 1760s that kind of put the southern border separating Maryland and Delaware from Pennsylvania and Virginia. So it's just a line that kind of separates a couple of states, but it came to symbolize the division of the North and the South. So, interestingly enough, before 1820, so back in the day, there was actually a lot more anti-slavery societies in the South than there were in the North. So really, at the beginning, there was kind of more, like I said, anti-slavery societies in the South than the North. But that all changed in the 1830s. One of the big things, kind of the nail in the coffin of this anti-slavery movement, small though it was in the South, was when the Virginia legislature, so the state of Virginia, their Congress, debated a number of issues regarding various, emancipation proposals. But once the Virginia legislation debated these issues, they really struck down all of the emancipation bills, you could say. And after that point, after Virginia really said no, a lot of other states slowly but surely started to kind of tighten their slave codes, really kind of stopped talking about the issue of slavery. We have a couple things going on this time too. We've talked about a number of them. Nate Turner's rebellion in 1831 really scared the bejesus out of the South. A lot of Southern planters were now sleeping with guns under their pillow. They're thinking of the slave rebellion that happened in Haiti and how pretty much that whole nation rebelled. A number of things. Nate Turner's rebellion really putting them on edge. We had the nullification crisis in South Carolina, which we talked about a couple chapters ago, that happened in 1832, and that's more showing that the South was really scared that the federal government might step in and get rid of slavery. They weren't excited about that. So after 1830, really, even if you wanted to discuss slavery in a rational manner, you couldn't do it. You could be beaten or jailed or even hung for even bringing up the subject anymore in the South. After 1830, they had made up their mind. They were sticking to it. And, there were the pro-slavery whites in the South that really defended slavery, really kind of made a lot of excuses for it. They defended it as a good thing. Right? So they said that slavery was supported in the Bible and that Aristotle had supported slavery. They said that, these Africans were living this kind of this barbarian existence in Africa, and it was a good thing that we transplanted them to America, which is much more civilized and much more Christianized. They saw kind of the master-slave relationship almost as kind of resembling that of a family. They said, oh, the slaves are a part of our family, which probably wasn't true. Could be, depending, but not always the case. And they also pointed to the wage slaves of the North. All of these people now working in these horrible conditions in the factories, dangerous conditions, stuck inside all day, barely making it through. So the people in the South constantly pointed to these wage slaves in the North and said, hey, our slaves have it way better down here. They're outside in the fresh air. They don't have to worry about unemployment, whatever. They'll be taken care of in their old age. They don't have to worry about that. So they made a lot of excuses about that. But really, the South was kind of placing themselves in opposition to the rest of the Western world. So it's not even just the North saying, "Hey, people in the South, like you're really kind of backwater, so to speak." But really, Britain, France, most of the Western world was kind of changing their mind in regards to slavery. Like we said, Britain had gotten rid of slavery. There's a lot of abolitionist movements in the North saying slavery, this is kind of old school sort of thing. So really the South was placing them in this kind of unique position, really kind of in opposition to kind of what was going on in the rest of the world. They were clinging to kind of this dying institution, so to speak. Nationally speaking, the issue of slavery was challenging, to say the least. There was something called the Gag Resolution that was passed by the House of Representatives, and it prohibited the debate or any action on any anti-slavery bills. So more or less, the House of Representatives, they passed this Gag Resolution that said any anti-slavery bill, we're going to just table it. We're not going to discuss it. We're not going to debate it. We're going to ignore it completely. So for about 8 years in the House of Representatives, there was this Gag Resolution, this kind of gag order. They weren't going to discuss it in the House of Representatives. Then again, our friend John Quincy Adams, Congressman John Quincy Adams, and former President John Quincy Adams, he fought once again to get this Gag Resolution repealed, so to speak. So eventually it was repealed through the actions of John Quincy Adams. So he's coming. He's just all over this chapter, I tell you what. Okay, so another kind of dent against our freedom of speech here came in the South too when it came to the mail, surprisingly, like the post office. So abolitionists would send a lot of anti-slavery junk mail, so to speak, to the South. And people in the South weren't very excited about receiving this anti-slavery mail. In fact, there was an instance where a mob in Charleston broke into the post office and burned a huge pile of this kind of anti-slavery propaganda or anti-slavery junk mail, as you could say it. So eventually Washington, D.C., or the folks in the federal government, actually told all of the southern post offices to destroy all abolitionist material. So it was more or less like, we don't want this problem, we don't want to deal with this issue anymore. I know there's a lot of people sending this anti-slavery junk mail down there. Hey, post office people, just don't deliver it, just destroy it. We don't want to make a ruckus in the South. So between the Gag Resolution and this kind of movement by Washington to stop delivering, anti-slavery mail, we kind of see, kind of a slap in the face of the freedom of press. Whatever. All right, we'll keep going on. Yes, just one more section left of this chapter. The Abolitionists' Impact in the North. So we're talking about how the North was kind of taking hold of the abolitionist movement. So abolitionists, especially the extreme ones like Garrison, that sort of thing, they were really unpopular in the North at first. So the North really didn't take hold of these extreme ideas of abolition right away. Of course, the North was still economically tied to the South. The Northern banks had loaned over $300 million to the Southern farmers. So they were worried that if the Union did dissolve, that there's no way they would get their money from the loans back, which is actually the case during the Civil War. The northern banks lost a lot of money they had loaned to the South. And of course, the New England textiles mills were very dependent on the South for cotton. Even in the North, at times they had outbursts against who they saw were these extreme abolitionists. Lewis Tappan, his New York home was broken into and destroyed by a mob while people in the street cheered them on. William Lloyd Garrison, that guy who wrote the newspaper called The Liberator, remember him? He was actually dragged through the streets of Boston and by a rope. They weren't quite fans. There is another example. There's a man called Reverend Elijah Lovejoy, and he produced a paper, an anti-slavery paper, and his printing press was destroyed 4 times, and then eventually in 1837 he was killed by a mob. So this is in the North, remind you. So, most people in the North, they didn't like the idea of slavery, but they were also kind of hostile to the idea of its immediate abolition. However, by 1850, the abolitionists were kind of making a dent in the North. Like I said, few really thought of getting rid of it completely, but a lot of people didn't want to see it expand into the new territories. And we'll see that later on with the Free Soil Party. So, the North was kind of interesting. They weren't perhaps as for abolition as you might think, but slowly but surely, it starts to change. And we'll see that in some chapters coming up here. But I think that